Good evening, and welcome back to Drift Through History. There is a particular kind of story that history offers only rarely, a story that exists simultaneously on two registers, as an archaeological fact and as a living myth, where the ruins in the ground and the poems in the air turn out to be describing the same thing from different distances. Tonight we're going to tell one of those stories. We're going to talk about Mycenaean Greece, the Bronze Age civilization that flourished on the Greek mainland and across the Aegean world, roughly from 1600 to 1100 BCE, that built palaces of dressed stone and bureaucratic empires, administered through a script that no one could read for 3,000 years, that fought wars on the plains of Anatolia and traded with Egypt and launched expeditions across the eastern Mediterranean, and that collapsed, suddenly and completely, into a darkness so total that the Greeks of 5 centuries later had only the dimmest memory of it, a memory preserved not in records but in poetry, not in administrative tablets but in the stories of heroes and gods and wandering kings that Homer eventually assembled into the 2 greatest poems of the ancient world. Tonight we're going to talk about the world behind the Odyssey, about the real palaces that inspired the palace of Odysseus, about the real ships that sailed to a real Troy, about the real system of power and trade and writing and bronze casting that sustained a civilization so sophisticated that its collapse left a wound in human memory that took 400 years to heal, and that shaped the literary and mythological imagination of the Western world so completely that we are still, in ways we do not always recognize, living with what Homer made of the ruins. Before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is genuinely the kind of thing you come here for. And as always, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight. Drop your city and your local time in the comments. I find something genuinely moving about the image of this drifting across different time zones simultaneously, some of you in the deep hours before sleep and some of you just settling in at the end of a long day. Now, dim the lights. Let the room go soft. Find a comfortable position. The Bronze Age is a long way away, and we have time to get there properly. You have nowhere to be. The Greek mainland before the Mycenaeans is not the Greece that anyone pictures when they hear the word Greece. It is not the marble and the columns and the philosophical schools and the democratic assemblies of classical Athens, which lie 1,000 years in the future. It is not even the archaic Greece of the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, when the first Greek city-states were beginning to take the institutional forms that the classical period would refine. The people who occupied the Greek mainland in the period before the Mycenaean palace culture emerged, the Middle Helladic period, roughly 2100 to 1600 BCE, were not culturally backward or static, but they were organized at a scale and a level of complexity considerably below what the palace period would achieve. Their material culture, the characteristic grey minion ware pottery, with its distinctive soapy texture and its wheel-thrown shapes that represent a significant technical advance over earlier handmade ceramics, shows a population that has practicing agriculture and herding for millennia, that had developed craft traditions of competence if not spectacular artistry, and that was organized into communities of moderate size without the palace-centered hierarchical structure that would emerge in the 17th century, the burial customs of the Middle Helladic period, simple inhumation in graves beneath or within the settlement with modest grave goods, contrast sharply with the spectacular wealth of the shaft graves that follow, suggesting a genuine social revolution in the period around 1600 BCE, in which a warrior elite accumulated wealth and power at a scale that the preceding social organization had not produced. The Indo-European question, The question of when and how the Greek-speaking population arrived on the Greek mainland is one of the most contested in prehistoric Greek scholarship. The traditional view associates the arrival of Greek-speaking people with a disruption in the archaeological record around 2100 BCE, at the beginning of the Middle Helladic period, when the destruction of existing settlements and the appearance of new cultural features suggests a significant population movement. More recent work has proposed various alternatives, including the possibility that Greek-speaking people were present in the Aegean from a much earlier period, or that the linguistic shift was less abrupt than the traditional archaeological break suggests. What is not disputed is that the people of the Shaft grave period were speaking an early form of Greek. The Linear B tablets prove it, and that the specific cultural synthesis that emerged in the 17th century BCE from the combination of the existing mainland tradition with Minoan influence was conducted in Greek. The Greek mainland before the Mycenaeans is not the Greece that anyone pictures. The Bronze Age Greek mainland of the early 2nd millennium BCE was a world of scattered agricultural communities, of small chieftains and local strongmen, of a population that had been living in the Aegean region for thousands of years before the specific cultural synthesis that we call Mycenaean began to emerge in the 17th century BCE. Understanding what Mycenaean civilization was requires understanding what it emerged from and what it was responding to, because civilizations do not appear from nowhere. They're always built on earlier foundations, always influenced by the civilizations around them, always the product of specific geographic and historical conditions that shaped what they became. The Mediterranean world of the early 2nd millennium BCE was not, despite appearances, a world of isolated civilizations. It was already a world of extensive and sophisticated long-distance contact, of trade networks that moved raw materials and finished goods and ideas across hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles of sea and land, and its specific dynamics have attracted the attention of scholars interested in the relationship between ancient globalization and modern globalization in ways that the Bronze Age collapse has made particularly salient. Eric Klein's 2014 book, 1177b, c. The year civilization collapse made the case for the Bronze Age as a genuinely globalized world whose interconnectedness was simultaneously its greatest strength and its greatest vulnerability, that the interdependence of the palace economies, which had created the commercial sophistication and the material abundance of the late Bronze Age, also created the fragility that the system's collapse of 1200 to 1150 BCE exploited. The parallel to the modern global economy, a system of mutual interdependence that has created unprecedented material abundance and that contains within its interdependence the same vulnerability to cascading failures that the Bronze Age system displayed, is not a coincidence that Klein makes explicitly, but that his readers have consistently found thought-provoking. The specific mechanism of cascading failure that the Bronze Age collapse exhibited, multiple stresses hitting a deeply interconnected system simultaneously, with the failure of each element removing the support that had been keeping other elements stable, until the whole system fails faster than any individual element's crisis would have predicted, is recognizable to anyone who has thought about complex systems, whether in ecology or economics or political science. The Bronze Age palaces were interdependent in ways that made the system as a whole more fragile than any individual palace, because the failure of the tin-copper trade route that supplied bronze to all of them was a stress that none of them could absorb alone, and the simultaneous failure of the agricultural base, the trade network, the political stability, and the diplomatic framework that had held the system together produced an outcome that no single stress would have produced in isolation. The Bronze Age Mediterranean was a globalized world avant la lettre, and the Mycenaeans were participants in this system from very early in their history, participants who began as relative latecomers to the palace economy world that Egypt and Mesopotamia and the Levantine city-states had been constructing for centuries, and who learned from their contact with those more developed systems with a speed and a thoroughness that would eventually make them major players in the Eastern Mediterranean commercial and diplomatic network. Before we talk about the Minoans as an influence on the Mycenaeans, they deserve a moment of their own, because they were one of the most genuinely distinctive civilizations the ancient world produced, and their specific character shaped everything that came after them in the Aegean world in ways that cannot be understood without first understanding what they were. The palace at Knossos on the northern coast of Crete, which Arthur Evans excavated beginning in 1900 and partially reconstructed in the controversial concrete and paint interventions that have divided archaeologists ever since, was the largest and most complex building in the Aegean world when it was constructed around 1700 BCE in its second palace form. It covered roughly 22,000 square metres, more than 5 acres, on the low hill above the Kairatos River, its hundreds of rooms organised around a large central court that oriented the entire complex toward the sky and the light in ways that the palace's sophisticated interior lightwell system extended into the building's depths. The palace had running water. It had a drainage system of terracotta pipes that carried waste away from the populated areas. It had a system of storage magazines along its western side that held enormous pithoi, storage jars so large that a person could stand inside them, filled with grain, olive oil, wine, and the other agricultural goods that the redistributive system collected and managed. And its walls were covered, in the living quarters and the ceremonial spaces and the processional corridors, with frescoes of extraordinary quality, images that are among the most compelling visual art produced in the ancient world before the classical period. The Minoan frescoes that the excavations at Knossos and the other Cretan palaces have recovered depict a world of startling vitality and aesthetic refinement. Women in elaborate dress, layered flounced skirts, fitted bodices, elaborately coiffed hair, move through ceremonial spaces and gather at gatherings whose specific nature scholars have debated for a century. Men and women both leap over charging bulls in the famous bull-leaping images, a ritual sport or ceremonial practice that appears repeatedly in the Minoan artistic record, and that has no close parallel in any other ancient civilization. Dolphins and flying fish move through the marine landscapes that decorated the Queen's Megaron. Processions of young men carry vessels to unseen recipients. Griffins, composite creatures with lion bodies and eagle heads, flank the throne in the throne room at Knossos, in images that have been there for 3,500 years. The whole visual world of the Minoan frescoes is organised around naturalistic observation, the specific observation of the natural world in its movement and its colour, combined with a formalised aesthetic convention that makes every image simultaneously recognisable and stylised, rooted in the real world and elevated above it. The single most important influence on early Mycenaean civilization was not Egypt. The single most important influence on early Mycenaean civilization was not Egypt, and not the Levant, and not Mesopotamia, though all of these had roles. It was Minoan Crete, the palace civilization that flourished on the large island of Crete from roughly 2000 to 1450 BCE, whose artistic achievement, whose administrative sophistication, whose commercial reach across the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean, and whose specific cultural style were absorbed by the Mycenaeans with an intensity that the archaeological record makes unmistakable. The Minoans, the name is modern, applied by Arthur Evans, who excavated the palace at Knossos in the early 20th century, after the legendary King Minos of Greek mythology built palace complexes of extraordinary size and refinement at Knossos, Thyestos, Malea, and Zakros, that were the administrative, religious, commercial, and artistic centres of Cretan civilization. These palaces were not primarily royal residences in the sense that later European palaces would be. They were redistributive economic centres, places where agricultural surplus was collected, stored, processed, and redistributed to the craftsmen and specialists and labourers who made the palace economy function, organised by an administrative class that used a writing system, Linear A, to track the movements of goods and people with remarkable precision. The specific nature of Minoan culture, its art, its religion, its administrative practices, its commercial networks, reached the Greek mainland through the medium of trade and exchange that connected the Aegean islands and the mainland in the centuries before the Mycenaeans became politically and militarily dominant. The frescoes of leaping bulls and elegant court figures, the ceramic tradition of the famous marine-style pottery with its octopuses and dolphins swimming across the surface of jars and cups, the palace architecture with its characteristic light wells and storage magazines and ceremonial spaces. All of these Minoan elements appear in the earliest Mycenaean palaces in forms that make the influence unmistakable. The Mycenaeans did not simply copy what they found in Crete. They absorbed it, adapted it, and transformed it into something that was specifically their own, more militarized, more overtly hierarchical, more concerned with the display of power through weapons and fortifications, but fundamentally shaped by the Minoan precedent in ways that ran from architecture to religion to administration. The shaft graves of Mycenae are where Mycenaean civilization announces itself to the archaeological record with a force and a suddenness that still startles. But before the graves themselves, the objects found within them deserve individual attention, because they are among the most beautiful things surviving from the ancient world, and because they tell us things about the Mycenaean elite's self-understanding that the administrative tablets cannot. The siege Rhyton, a silver vessel in the shape of a bull's head, found in the shaft graves whose surface is decorated with a relief scene of a coastal city under attack, its defenders on the walls, its attackers assaulting from ships, is the earliest unambiguous representation of naval warfare in the Aegean world, and its presence in a royal Mycenaean grave of approximately 1550 to 1500 BCE tells you something specific about how the early Mycenaean elite understood its own power, as maritime as well as terrestrial, as projecting force at sea as well as on land. The Cup of Nestor, another shaft grave object, a gold cup with two handles and doves perching on the handles, which Schliemann identified with the cup of extraordinary size and weight that Homer describes Nestor drinking from in the Iliad, and which is indeed a drinking cup of considerable magnificence, shows the goldsmith's art at a level of technical achievement that the palace workshops were already reaching in the earliest phase of Mycenaean civilization. The inlaid daggers of the shaft graves are among the most technically accomplished metalwork objects of the Bronze Age world. Their blades are inlaid with scenes of hunting and landscape in silver and gold niello, a technique that required the mastery of multiple metalworking traditions and the specific tools and knowledge to execute it, depicting lions hunting waterfowl, leopards hunting deer, warriors hunting lions with shields of figure-eight shape that appear throughout the Mycenaean artistic tradition. These daggers were not weapons in any practical sense. They were too precious and too delicate to use in combat. They were statements about the owner's identity and status, gifts between powerful men, or expressions of personal excellence that were beautiful enough and expensive enough to communicate their message without words. The shaft graves of Mycenae are where Mycenaean civilization announces itself to the archaeological record. The site of Mycenae sits on a rocky hill in the northeastern Peloponnese, commanding the road from the Argive plain to the north, a position whose strategic importance is immediately apparent to anyone who stands on the citadel and looks out over the landscape, understanding in a glance why anyone who wanted to control movement through this part of Greece would want to control this hill. The modern visitor approaches through the famous Lion Gate, the entrance to the citadel whose stone lintel is decorated with the carved relief of two lions flanking a column, the oldest monumental sculpture on the Greek mainland, and one of the most evocative images of the Bronze Age world. Inside the citadel, within a circular enclosure of stone slabs that a later Mycenaean builder carefully preserved when expanding the fortification walls, preserving it because the graves it marked were already ancient and already sacred, lie the shaft graves that Heinrich Schliemann excavated in 1876. Schliemann is one of the most romantic and most problematic figures in the history of archaeology, a self-made German-American businessman who had taught himself Greek in his spare time and who had become convinced, at a time when most classical scholars believed the Trojan War was pure mythology, that the stories of Homer described real places and real events, and who had spent his personal fortune digging for them. His biography is itself extraordinary. Born in 1822 in the German Duchy of Mecklenburg as the son of a Protestant pastor, he had worked as a grocer's apprentice, a cabin boy, an agent for a Dutch merchant firm, and eventually a commodities trader whose ability to learn languages he claimed to have mastered 17, including ancient and modern Greek, and whose commercial instinct in the right markets at the right times made him one of the wealthier self-made men of the mid-19th century. He made his first fortune in Russia as an indigo trader, his second in California during the gold rush, and his third through various commercial ventures that left him wealthy enough, by the 1860s, to retire from business and pursue the obsession that had been with him since childhood: finding Troy. He began at Hisarlik in 1870, working with the local authorities' permission and with the assistance of Frank Calvert, an Anglo-American diplomat who had been quietly excavating on the hill for years, and who had concluded before Schliemann arrived that it was the site of Troy. Schliemann's methods were by later standards appalling. He drove a great trench through the centre of the mound with hundreds of workmen, destroying layers that subsequent generations of archaeologists have mourned the loss of, looking for the Troy of the Trojan War, and in his haste cutting through it without recognizing it. The spectacular find he made in 1873, a cache of gold objects including a diadem, earrings, cups, and other items that he photographed on his wife Sophia's head and announced as Priam's treasure, came from Troyes, a city that had been destroyed around 2400 BCE, roughly 1,000 years before any plausible date for the Trojan War. He had found treasure. It was not the right treasure. The later Schliemann, chastened somewhat by scholarly criticism and improved by the collaboration of the architect Wilhelm Dörpfeld, was a better archaeologist than the early one, and the excavations at Mycenae in 1876 that found the shaft graves were conducted with more care and with results that even his critics could not minimize. Whatever his methods, whatever his tendency to let Homer guide his interpretations well beyond where the evidence warranted, Schliemann gave the world the Mycenaean Bronze Age. He made the material reality of a civilization that scholarship had treated as mythology, visible in the most dramatic way imaginable, through gold death masks and silver cups and bronze weapons that were simultaneously beautiful and undeniably real. Schliemann is one of the most romantic and most problematic figures in the history of archaeology. His excavations at Mycenae produced results that exceeded even his dramatic expectations. He found the shaft graves filled with the most spectacular concentration of gold objects that Bronze Age Europe had produced. Golden death masks, golden diadems, golden cups, swords with gold inlaid hilts, amber beads from the Baltic, ostrich eggs from Africa, ivory from the eastern Mediterranean, the grave goods of warriors and rulers who had commanded sufficient wealth and power to equip themselves for death with the concentrated opulence of an entire civilization's surplus. Schliemann, who had expected to find Agamemnon and whose imagination was running well ahead of his archaeological caution, telegraphed the king of Greece that he had gazed upon the face of Agamemnon, referring to one of the golden death masks, the one that now bears that name in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, the serene and slightly unreal face of a Bronze Age ruler whose actual identity we will never know. The identification was wrong. The shaft graves date to roughly 1550 to 1500 BCE, and the Trojan War, if it happened, is generally placed around 1200 BCE, 3 centuries later. But what Schliemann had found was real and extraordinary on its own terms. He had found the material evidence of the emergence of the Mycenaean warrior elite, the ruling class whose power was expressed in gold and bronze, and the organized violence that accumulated them. The picture that the shaft graves paint of early Mycenaean society is one of a martial aristocracy, accumulating wealth at a remarkable rate through a combination of trade, raiding, and the agricultural surplus of the territories they controlled. The weapons in the graves, the swords with their elaborate hilted construction, the boar's tusk helmets whose specific construction Homer describes accurately in the Iliad centuries after they had ceased to be used, the dagger blades inlaid with hunting scenes of silver and gold, speak of men who understood themselves primarily as warriors and who organized the aesthetic of their lives around the display of martial excellence. The gold that surrounded them in death came from trade with the Minoan world and from exchange with Egypt and the Levant, gold that moved through the eastern Mediterranean trade networks in both directions, north and south, east and west, in quantities that required the kind of sustained commercial relationship that Bronze Age palace economies developed and maintained with considerable sophistication. The transition from the shaft grave period to the palace period, from roughly 1500 to 1400 BCE, is the transition from a culture expressing itself primarily through warrior aristocracy and portable wealth, to a culture expressing itself through monumental architecture, territorial administration, and the apparatus of a palatial state. The tholos tombs that mark this transition, the great beehive-shaped underground chambers with their corbel domes and their long, stone-lined entrance corridors, represent both a continuity with the shaft grave tradition of spectacular burial and a transformation of its scale and ambition that reflects the increasing institutional complexity and territorial reach of the mature Mycenaean palace states. The treasury of Atreus at Mycenae, called that by the traveller Pausanias in the 2nd century CE and by every guidebook since, though it has nothing to do with Atreus and was a tomb rather than a treasury, was built around 1250 BCE and represents the apex of Mycenaean architectural achievement. Its corbel dome, constructed without mortar by laying successive courses of stone blocks so that each course projects slightly inward until the courses meet at the top, reaches a height of over 13 metres and a diameter of nearly 15, dimensions that would not be surpassed in the ancient world until the Pantheon in Rome was built 15 centuries later. The lintel blocks over the entrance weigh more than 100 tons each. The construction required the organisation of a labour force, a supply chain for the stone, and an engineering capability that only the mature palace system could have provided, and the effort invested in it tells you something specific about what the Mycenaean rulers thought death and the afterlife required. The most impressive architecture the civilization could produce, organised with the full resources of the palace administrative system to house the body of the person who had commanded those resources in life. The palaces that the Mycenaeans built at Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes or Komnenos and Athens in the period between roughly 1400 and 1200 BCE are the central evidence for what Mycenaean civilization actually was in its maturity, and they are extraordinary structures in ways that the later Greek world, which built in marble with the resources of a commercial empire, would have recognized as the achievements of a genuinely different kind of power. The Mycenaean palace was built around a central architectural unit called the Megaron, a large rectangular hall with a central hearth, a roof supported on 4 wooden columns, a columned porch entrance, and a vestibule between the porch and the main hall. The Megaron was the throne room, the ceremonial centre, the administrative and religious heart of the palace complex. Around it were arranged the storage magazines, the workshops, the residential quarters for the palace staff, the rooms for processing the agricultural goods that the palace collected as taxation from the surrounding countryside, the oil presses and the grain storage pits and the rooms where craftsmen produced the finished goods that the palace traded and redistributed. The walls were plastered and painted with frescoes, hunting scenes, processional scenes, battle scenes, the figures of women in the elaborate Minoan-derived fashion of layered skirts and elaborate coiffure, the stylized landscape backgrounds of running spirals and abstract patterns that covered every surface with a richness that must have been simultaneously overwhelming and deeply familiar to the people who lived and worked within it. The palace at Pylos, on the southwestern coast of the Peloponnese, usually identified as the palace of Nestor, the old king of Pylos who appears in the Iliad as a minor character and in the Odyssey as a major one, whose wisdom and hospitality Telemachus consults early in his search for his father, is the best preserved of the Mycenaean palaces, and walking through its remains gives the most complete sense available of what these buildings actually were. The site was excavated beginning in 1939 by Carl Bliegen, and the archive of Linear B tablets he found in the palace's administrative rooms was one of the most important Bronze Age finds of the 20th century. The palace burned. All the Mycenaean palaces burned in the late 13th or early 12th century BCE in the catastrophe we will discuss at length. And the fire that destroyed it also baked the clay tablets of the administrative archive to a hardness that preserved them through 3,000 years of burial. What the tablets preserve, when Michael Ventris deciphered them in 1952, was the earliest written Greek in existence, and the story of that decipherment is itself one of the great intellectual detective stories of modern scholarship. Linear B is the writing system that the Mycenaeans used to administer their palace economies, and its decipherment in 1952 by Michael Ventris, a British architect who'd been working on the problem as an amateur on the side, and who cracked it in a few weeks of inspired analysis after years of collective scholarly effort had failed to do so, is one of the most dramatic moments in the history of ancient languages. But to understand the magnitude of what Ventris accomplished, you need to understand how impossible the problem had seemed and how many distinguished scholars had failed to solve it before him. Arthur Evans himself, who had found the first Linear B tablets at Knossos in 1900 and who had controlled access to the Knossos material with a jealous thoroughness that other scholars found frustrating, had believed until his death in 1941 that Linear B was an early form of Minoan writing representing a non-Greek language. His authority in the field was such that the assumption persisted long after it should have been questioned. The American classical scholar Alice Kober, working in the 1940s, made the critical breakthrough of demonstrating that the sign patterns in Linear B showed the inflectional endings of an Indo-European language. The specific mathematical observation that certain signs at the ends of words varied in consistent patterns that corresponded to what grammatical inflections would look like in a syllabic script. Kober died of cancer in 1950, before the full significance of her analysis could be realized, and her contribution to the decipherment has been consistently under-acknowledged in the popular accounts that give all the credit to Ventris. Ventris himself came to the problem as a schoolboy. He had heard Evans lecture about the undeciphered script when he was 14 years old and had decided then that he would solve it, an ambition he pursued alongside his architectural training and career with a systematic intelligence and a willingness to share his work in progress with other scholars through a series of circular letters that constitute one of the most remarkable documentary records of a live intellectual breakthrough in the history of scholarship. His work notes, published posthumously, show the specific steps by which he moved from Kober's grid of sign relationships through the assignment of phonetic values to the moment of recognition that the language was Greek. The recognition, when it came partly through the place names. Ventris was working with the Knossos tablets when he noticed that certain sign clusters appeared where geographical names would be expected in an administrative context. He tested the assignment of phonetic values derived from the Cypriot syllabary, a later script that shared some signs with Linear B, against these place names, and found that they produced recognizable forms of place names known from ancient Crete. Knossos itself, Amnisos, Tylissos. When the phonetic values that worked for the place names were applied to other words in the tablets, they produced recognizable Greek forms, including the word for tripod and the word for jar and the word for horse, in combinations that matched descriptions in the tablet texts. Linear B is the writing system that the Mycenaeans used to administer their palace economies. The script had been known to scholars since Arthur Evans found the first tablets at Knossos in the 1890s, and it had been recognized as related to but distinct from the earlier Linear A of the Minoans, which remains undeciphered to this day. For 50 years, scholars had debated what language it represented, with the majority opinion leaning towards some non-Greek language. Perhaps a precursor of Minoan, perhaps something else entirely, partly because the assumption was that Greek could not have been written this early, that the Greeks of the Bronze Age were not literate in this way. Ventris, approaching the problem without the preconceptions that professional classical scholarship had accumulated, noticed that certain sign clusters appeared repeatedly at the end of words in patterns consistent with the inflectional endings of an Indo-European language. He worked through a series of increasingly specific phonetic assignments, borrowing from the scholarly work on Cypriot syllabary, a later script that preserved some of the same signs. And in a BBC radio talk in June 1952, before he had finished working through the implications himself, he announced that the language behind Linear B appeared to be Greek, an early, archaic, palatial Greek, written in a syllabic script that represented the language imperfectly but recognizably, a Greek so old that it predated the alphabet that later Greece would use by 5 centuries, that predated Homer by 3 centuries. That was the language of the people whose ruins Homer's poems described and whose memory Homer's poems preserved. The tablets that Ventris and the scholar John Chadwick subsequently translated over the following years revealed a picture of Mycenaean palace administration of extraordinary completeness and unexpected specificity. They were not literature, they were not history, they were not religious texts, they were records, inventories of goods, personnel lists, land tenure records, ration allocations, records of bronze being distributed to smiths and returned as finished weapons, records of women workers and their children in the palace textile workshops, records of offerings to gods whose names were recognizably the names of the Greek gods of the classical period: Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Athena, Artemis, Dionysus, demonstrating that the religious world of later Greece was already present in the Bronze Age in forms recognizable enough to be described with the same names. What the tablets showed was a palace economy of considerable administrative sophistication, a redistributive system in which the palace functioned as the centre of economic life for the surrounding territory, collecting agricultural surplus through a taxation system that the tablets recorded in detail, processing it through palace workshops, and redistributing it as rations, raw materials and finished goods to the various categories of palace dependents and service personnel. The social structure that the tablets reveal was organized in a hierarchy that the Linear B vocabulary makes specific and that the later Greek world preserved in mythologized form. At the apex was the Wonax as the palace king, whose authority was expressed through the redistribution of resources and whose position combined the political, religious, economic, and military functions that later Greek civilization would distribute among separate institutional roles. Below the Wonax was the Lauagetas, the leader of the people, probably the military commander, whose specific functions relative to the Wonax are debated but whose presence in the administrative hierarchy is consistent across the tablet archives. Below these two principal figures were the Telestai, land-holding nobles who provided military service and administrative support in exchange for their land tenures, and the Hecatai, the companions or followers of the Wonax who appear to have been a kind of personal guard and administrative corps simultaneously. Below the noble class were the palace craftsmen, the bronze smiths whose output the tablets track in precise detail, each smith recorded as receiving a specific weight of bronze and expected to return a specific quantity of finished weapons or tools, the accounting precise enough to identify smiths who had not delivered their quota and to record what they owed. The textile workers, primarily women, organized into large workshops at multiple locations in the palace territory, received standardized rations of grain and figs in exchange for their weaving, their children fed at reduced ration rates. The land lease records show a complex system of tenure in which palace land was leased to various categories of holders in exchange for service obligations, creating a network of obligations running upward to the palace that bound the agricultural economy tightly to the palace administrative system. What the tablets do not show is any market economy in the modern sense, any system in which goods were exchanged through the mechanism of voluntary price setting between buyers and sellers. The Mycenaean palace economy was redistributive in the strict anthropological sense. Goods flowed to the centre, were processed and stored there, and flowed out again as palace-directed redistribution. There was trade between the Mycenaean world and the outside. The Uluburun wreck is evidence of that. But the trade appears to have been conducted primarily as palace-to-palace exchange of elite goods, rather than as the decentralized market commerce that classical Greek and later Mediterranean economies developed. This specific institutional form of Mycenaean commerce was the gift exchange between palace authorities, the Bronze Age diplomatic custom that the Amarna letters document, in which great kings sent each other gold and horses and craftsmen, and the products of their territories as expressions of their relationship and their relative power, not as market transactions with a set price, but as diplomatic exchanges whose value was calculated in terms of honor and reciprocity. What the tablets showed was a palace economy of considerable administrative sophistication. The religious dimension of the tablets has been one of the most productive for understanding the relationship between Mycenaean and later Greek culture, but the tablets are only one source for Mycenaean religion, and the other sources, the archaeology of cult sites, the evidence of burial customs, the artistic representations of religious practice, add dimensions that the administrative records cannot provide. Mycenaean religious practice was, as far as the evidence allows us to reconstruct it, a combination of the Minoan religious tradition that the Mycenaeans absorbed in their formative period and indigenous Greek religious elements that predated Minoan influence. The goddess figures that appear throughout Minoan art, the so-called snake goddess of the Boston faience figurines, the female figures who dominate the Minoan fresco tradition, have counterparts in Mycenaean religious imagery, suggesting the continuation of a goddess cult tradition that the classical Greek pantheon would eventually absorb into the figures of Hera and Athena and Artemis and Demeter. The bull-leaping imagery of Minoan art appears in Mycenaean fresco traditions, suggesting that this ritual, whatever its specific nature, was adopted along with the artistic conventions that represented it. The specific Mycenaean burial customs that the shaft graves and the later tholos tombs represent are among the clearest expressions of Mycenaean religious belief available, because burial practices reflect belief about death and the afterlife more directly than most other material evidence. The shaft graves of the early Mycenaean period, deep rectangular shafts cut into the rock, the bodies laid on the floor with their most valued possessions, gave way in the mature Mycenaean period to the tholos tomb. The beehive-shaped underground chamber approached through a long stone-lined corridor called a dromos, and covered by an earthen mound above ground. The tholos tombs are engineering achievements of the first order, the treasury of Atreus at Mycenae, the best preserved, has a corbelled dome 43 feet high and 47 feet in diameter, built without mortar from carefully cut stone blocks, whose construction required the kind of precision engineering and organizational capacity that the palace system was capable of providing. These were not simple graves. They were monuments to the continuing power and presence of the dead, maintained as places of cult activity where offerings could be made, and the relationship between the living and the powerful dead could be sustained. The warrior ideology that the shaft grave weapons and the later fresco battle scenes express was not merely a practical matter of military organization. It was the central organizing value of Mycenaean elite identity, and it shaped everything from burial practice to artistic convention to the specific stories that the oral tradition preserved and eventually delivered to Homer. The great Mycenaean warriors of the tradition, Achilles, Agamemnon, Odysseus, Hector, are defined entirely by their excellence in battle, their prowess with weapons, their capacity to endure suffering and inflict it, their complex relationships with honor and shame and the social codes that warriors maintained among themselves. The specific form that the warrior ideal takes in the Iliad, the concern with kleos, with glory that outlasts the man who earns it, with the paradox that the greatest warriors are often the shortest lived, is a form that makes most sense as the expression of a society in which warriors occupied the top of the social hierarchy, and in which martial excellence was the primary way of establishing and maintaining social position. The religious dimension of the tablets has been one of the most productive. The gods who receive offerings in the Pylos tablets are the gods of Homer and of classical Greek religion, not identical to their later selves, since 5 centuries of religious development separates the Bronze Age tablets from the classical period. but recognisably the same figures with the same names. Poseidon appears as a major recipient of offerings at Pylos, which is entirely consistent with the role that Poseidon plays in both the Iliad and the Odyssey, where he is one of the most active divine participants in the Trojan War and its aftermath. Poseidon, who shakes the earth and commands the sea, whose anger drives Odysseus from one disaster to the next across 10 years of wandering. The continuity between the Bronze Age and the classical religious world, which the Linear B tablets demonstrate with documentary precision, is one of the most significant findings of 20th century Bronze Age scholarship. To understand what the Mycenaeans were doing in the broader Bronze Age world, what they were trading, whom they were fighting, what position they occupied in the complex network of palace economies that connected the Eastern Mediterranean in the 2nd millennium BCE, you need to understand the remarkable document known as the Uluburun shipwreck. This ship sank off the coast of southwestern Turkey near the town of Kars, in waters that the captain was probably navigating on a well-established trade route between the Levantine coast and the Aegean, sometime around 1300 BCE. It lay on the seabed until a Turkish sponge diver spotted it in 1982, and the subsequent excavation, 11 seasons of underwater archaeology conducted by George Bess and Tamal Pulak of the Institute of Nautical Archaeology, produced the most complete picture available of what a late Bronze Age merchant vessel looked like and what it carried. The ship's cargo was extraordinary in its diversity and its geographic range. 10 tons of copper ingots in the characteristic ox-hide shape that was the standard unit of Bronze Age copper trade, copper that almost certainly came from Cyprus, which was the primary copper-producing region of the Bronze Age Mediterranean. The bronze that this copper would be combined with tin to produce was the defining material of the age and the substance on which the entire Mycenaean military and economic system depended. Bronze, the alloy of approximately 90% copper and 10% tin that was harder and more workable than either of its components, was the material from which weapons, armour, tools, vessels and architectural fittings were made throughout the Bronze Age Mediterranean, and its production required the specific combination of copper and tin that no single region of the ancient world possessed simultaneously. The copper of Cyprus and the tin of Afghanistan or the Taurus Mountains of Anatolia had to travel hundreds or thousands of miles to meet in the smelting furnaces of the palace workshops, which meant that the bronze production on which Mycenaean military power rested was absolutely dependent on the maintenance of the long-distance trade networks that the Uluburun ship was part of. The Mycenaean military that this bronze equipped was organised around the chariot in ways that are visible both in the fresco traditions and in the Linear B tablets, which record large numbers of chariots and chariot wheels and horses in inventories that suggest the chariot was a standard feature of Mycenaean military organisation. The chariot had been the dominant military technology of the late Bronze Age Near East. The Hittites and Egyptians had fought the Great Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BCE, the largest chariot battle in history, each side fielding thousands of chariots in an engagement whose inconclusive outcome both sides subsequently claimed as a victory and whose peace treaty is the oldest known in the history of diplomacy. The Mycenaeans adopted the chariot as both a military instrument and a prestige object, and the specific combination of chariot-borne warriors and infantry that the palace military system maintained was the expression of a military organisation at the forefront of late Bronze Age technology. The bronze armour that the Mycenaean warrior wore, the remarkable Dendra panoply, found in a Tholos tomb near Medea in the Argolid, and now in the Nafplion Museum, consisting of a complete set of bronze plates covering the torso, shoulders and upper arms, with bronze greaves for the lower legs and a boar's tusk helmet, was an expression of the material resources that the palace system could concentrate on equipping its most important military personnel. The Dendra armour dates to approximately 1450 BCE and is the most complete bronze armour from the ancient world, and its existence confirms what the Linear B tablets suggest, that the Mycenaean palace invested significant quantities of bronze and significant quantities of skilled labour in equipping its warrior class with the most effective protective equipment the technology of the period could produce. The ship's cargo was extraordinary in its diversity and its geographic range. 1 ton of tin ingots, whose origin was probably Afghanistan or the Taurus Mountains of Anatolia, transported across hundreds of miles of overland and sea routes before reaching the ship. Canaanite amphorae filled with terebinth resin, used for incense and possibly for wine and olive oil. Ebony logs from tropical Africa. Hippopotamus, ivory and elephant ivory, both carved and raw. Glass ingots of cobalt blue, turquoise and lavender. Some of the earliest manufactured glass in the world, probably from Egypt or the Levant. Gold jewellery and gold scrap. A golden scarab bearing the cartouche of the Egyptian queen Nefertiti. Cypriot pottery, Mycenaean pottery, Canaanite pottery, weapons and tools of bronze. A diptych writing board, 2 wooden leaves that would have held wax writing surfaces, a writing technology that Homer describes in the Iliad in the only reference to writing in either of the 2 great epics, suggesting that the diptych was a known object in the tradition Homer was drawing on. Tin bronze figurines of Canaanite deities, an Assyrian cylinder seal, a Kassite cylinder seal from Babylon, a merchant set of balance weights in multiple systems, allowing the ship's traders to calculate in Egyptian, Levantine and Aegean weight standards simultaneously. This ship, and the network it participated in, is the context within which Mycenaean civilization operated at its height. The Mycenaeans were not isolated warriors living on a rocky peninsula at the edge of the known world. They were participants, active, commercially sophisticated, diplomatically engaged participants in the most extensive trading network the ancient world had yet produced, exchanging their pottery and their oil, and their wool textiles and their craftwork for the tin and copper and ivory and glass and gold that the palace economies consumed and required. The Amarna letters, the diplomatic correspondence archive found at the Egyptian capital that the pharaoh Akhenaten built and abandoned in the 14th century BCE, contain letters from the rulers of Alashia, Cyprus and Hatti, the Hittite Empire, and Babylon and Mitanni and Ugarit to the Egyptian pharaoh and back, a picture of late Bronze Age diplomacy of extraordinary sophistication, in which the kings of the great powers addressed each other as brothers, exchanged gifts of gold and finished goods and horses and craftsmen, and sometimes daughters, and conducted a continuous negotiation over the commercial and diplomatic arrangements that sustained the system. The Mycenaeans, referred to as Ahiawa in the Hittite texts, a name whose relationship to the Greek word Achaeans, the term Homer uses for the Greeks at Troy, has been one of the most productive and most contested discussions in Bronze Age scholarship, appear in these texts as a significant power, one whose maritime reach and commercial weight the Hittites and Egyptians both needed to account for in their regional calculations. The question of Troy is the question that shadows everything else in the Mycenaean story, the question that has been generating scholarly controversy and popular fascination in roughly equal measure since Schliemann announced in 1873 that he had found Priam's treasure in the ruins of a city on the hill of Hisarlik in northwestern Turkey. The Trojan War, as Homer describes it, the 10-year siege, the wooden horse, the quarrel of Achilles, the embassy to Achilles, the death of Hector, The Fall and Burning of the City, is a poem, a work of literary art composed and recomposed across centuries of oral tradition before it reached anything like the form we know. It is not a historical document in the sense that allows you to say, yes, this is what happened in approximately 1184 BCE as Eratosthenes calculated, but the question of whether the poem reflects a real event, whether a real Mycenaean expedition did attack a real city at Hisarlik, for whatever combination of commercial and political and dynastic reasons, and whether the memory of that expedition was preserved across the Dark Age in the oral tradition that eventually became the Iliad, is a question that the archaeological evidence has been addressing for a century and a half with increasingly complex and nuanced results. Hisarlik is real. The hill has been occupied continuously for thousands of years, and the archaeological excavation of its layers, begun by Frank Calvert and then Schliemann in the 1870s, continued by Wilhelm Dörpfeld and then Carl Blegen in the 20th century, and most recently by Manfred Kaufmann from 1988 until his death in 2005, has identified at least 9 major occupation levels, each built on the ruins of the previous one. The level that most archaeologists now associate with the Troy of the Trojan War is Troy the Sephanae, a substantial city that was violently destroyed around 1180 BCE, its buildings burned, its stones thrown down, with signs of intense conflagration and of human remains in the destruction layer that suggests something more violent than a simple abandonment. Troy 6, the level beneath it, was a more impressive city, larger, with massive limestone walls of dressed stone, a lower town of considerable size that Kaufmann's excavations revealed to be far larger than previously understood, but it appears to have been destroyed by an earthquake rather than by human violence, sometime around 1250 BCE, the specific identification of which Troy is the Homeric Troy. It's destroyed by earthquake around 1250, or Zeseth, destroyed by human violence around 1180, is a question the evidence has not definitively settled, and the honest answer is that the Trojan War, if it happened, may have been a memory of multiple different attacks on the city across the period, compressed by oral tradition into the single great siege that Homer describes. What is not in serious dispute is that Hisarlik was a real and significant city in the period when the Mycenaean palace system was at its height, that it sat at the entrance to the Hellespont, the strait connecting the Aegean to the Sea of Marmara, and thence to the Black Sea, the route through which the tin and copper and grain of the Black Sea coast moved westward into the Aegean, and that controlling or influencing the city at the Hellespont's mouth would have been of considerable strategic and commercial importance to the Mycenaean palace states that depended on that trade. The Hittite texts mention a city called Wilusa in their correspondence, a city that has been identified with significant confidence by a combination of linguistic analysis and geographic reasoning with the Greek Ilios or Willian, the other name for Troy that appears in the Iliad. The Hittites and the Ahiawa, the Mycenaeans, are described in these texts as being in conflict over Wilusa on at least one occasion, with a Hittite king addressing the king of Ahiawa about their competing interests in the city. This is not the Trojan War in Homer's version. The Hittites are not mentioned in the Iliad, and the Hittite perspective on whatever conflict is being described is a bureaucratic note in a diplomatic archive rather than a literary epic. But it is evidence that something real underlies Homer's memory, that the plains of the Troad were genuinely a zone of Mycenaean-era conflict, and that the city at the entrance to the Hellespont was genuinely a significant enough prize to be worth fighting over. The world that Odysseus inhabits in Homer's poem is both recognisably Bronze Age and recognisably post-Bronze Age. a palimpsest in which the memory of palace civilization overlaps with the reality of the Dark Age that followed it, in which the great halls of kings exist alongside a social world of wandering heroes and improvised authority that looks nothing like the redistributive palace economy the Linear B tablets describe. The question of Homer, of who composed the Iliad and the Odyssey, when and how, is one of the most intensely debated questions in classical scholarship, and has been generating what is called the Homeric question since Friedrich August Wolff raised it systematically in 1795. The traditional view, which goes back to antiquity itself, holds that a poet named Homer composed both poems, probably in the 8th century BCE, drawing on the oral tradition of the previous 4 centuries. The alternative view, associated with Wolff and developed by subsequent scholars, holds that the poems are composite works, assembled from shorter oral poems by multiple authors over an extended period, with the unity we perceive being a later editorial achievement. The position that has gained the most scholarly support in the modern period, developed through the work of Milman Parry in the 1920s and 1930s, and his student Albert Lord, who studied living oral epic traditions in Yugoslavia and used their findings to analyze the specific features of the Homeric text, is that the Iliad and Odyssey are the products of an oral tradition in which skilled poets composed and recomposed the poems in performance, using a system of formulaic phrases and compositional conventions that allowed them to produce thousands of lines of verse without writing. Whether a single poet of exceptional genius crystallized the tradition into the specific poems we have, or whether the poems are more genuinely collective achievements, remains contested. What Parry and Lord's work established with considerable certainty is the oral formulaic character of the Homeric text, the fact that the specific formulae that appear throughout the poems, the repeated epithets, and the repeated narrative passages and the repeated speeches are not monotonous failures of imagination, but the functional vocabulary of an oral composition system, units of pre-made text that fit specific metrical slots, and that the oral poet uses the way a writer uses words, combining them in new configurations to express new content while drawing on the pre-existing system for the basic linguistic building blocks. The formula rosy-fingered dawn, which appears approximately 20 times in each poem, is not a sign that Homer ran out of ways to describe the morning. It is a unit of pre-made text that fits the specific metrical slot at the beginning of a dactylic hexameter line, and that carries with it the accumulated resonance of every previous time it has been used, each use drawing on the tradition of all the previous uses, loading the simple image of the sunrise with the weight of everything that has been begun with it before. The world that Odysseus inhabits in Homer's poem is both recognizably Bronze Age and recognizably post-Bronze Age Homer was working. Whenever he was working, the traditional date is the 8th century BCE, and the scholarly debate about whether there was a single composer named Homer or a tradition of oral composition that crystallized in the Iliad and Odyssey around that date has never been fully resolved. From an oral tradition that had been preserving and transforming the memory of the Bronze Age across several centuries of illiteracy, and the specific features of the poems that correspond to Bronze Age reality versus the reality of the 8th century versus pure poetic invention are the subject of an ongoing scholarly conversation that has been running for well over a century. What is striking, and what the Linear B tablets and the archaeological evidence together make possible to see more clearly than any previous generation of scholars could, is how much Bronze Age reality the poems preserve despite 5 centuries of transformation. The specific details of material culture that appear in the Iliad are often Bronze Age details. the boar's tusk helmets that the tablets and the archaeological record confirm were in use in the late Bronze Age and had disappeared well before the Archaic period. The practice of cremation burial that appears in the Iliad contradicts the inhumation burial of the Archaic period, but corresponds to practice that appears in the transition period between the Bronze Age and the Dark Age. The great bronze cauldrons that appear repeatedly in the poems as gifts and prizes at funeral games were genuine prestige objects of the Bronze Age in ways they were not in the Archaic period. The formulaic epithets that organize the Homeric description of persons and places, Achilles of the swift feet, Hector of the glancing helm, rosy-fingered dawn, the wine-dark sea, are the deposits of the oral tradition in which the specific formulae that fit specific metrical patterns were developed and preserved across generations of performance, their specific content often reflecting a world older than the performer. The palace of Odysseus on Ithaca, with its great hall and its bronze threshold and its 12 axes through whose rings the suitors cannot shoot, with its wine cellar full of the jars the old nurse Euryclea has maintained through 20 years of the master's absence, is the memory of a Mycenaean megaron, filtered through 5 centuries of oral tradition. The suitors who eat through Odysseus's stores and court his wife are in some ways more reminiscent of the Dark Age aristocracy. The basileia, the local chieftains of the 8th century who commanded loyalty through personal authority rather than through the redistributive mechanism of palace administration, than of the palace nobility of the Linear B period. But the framing, the single king who commands the loyalty of an island, whose household is the centre of the political and economic life of his territory, whose return from a long absence must be managed through disguise and tested through ordeal before the restoration of rightful order can be accomplished, is a story whose deepest logic comes from the palace world of the Bronze Age, from the world where the king was the palace, and the palace was the world, and the destruction of that order was a catastrophe beyond imagining. The catastrophe came sometime between 1200 and 1150 BCE, across a period of perhaps 2 generations. The Mycenaean palace system collapsed. Every major palace of the Greek mainland was destroyed and burned, but to understand the Bronze Age collapse properly, you need to see it in its full Mediterranean context, because what happened in Greece between 1200 and 1150 was not an isolated event. It was the local expression of a catastrophe that swept the entire Eastern Mediterranean world within the space of a generation, destroying civilizations that had been developing for centuries and resetting the political and cultural map of the ancient Near East in ways whose consequences are still visible in the world today. The Egyptian records from the reign of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu describe, in one of the most dramatic inscriptions in ancient Egyptian history, an event that the Egyptians experienced as an existential crisis. Groups of peoples whom the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples, a collective term for what appears to have been a diverse coalition of migrating and raiding groups whose specific identities are the subject of ongoing scholarly debate, attacked Egypt by land and by sea in the 8th year of Ramesses III's reign, approximately 1177 BCE. The Medinet Habu inscription describes a scene of cosmological disaster. No land could stand before their arms, from Hatti, Kode, Karkemish, Arzawa, and Alashaya. They were cut off at one time. A camp was set up in Amuru. They desolated its people, and its land was like that which has never come into being. The specific peoples named in the Egyptian records include the Peliset, almost certainly the Philistines of the biblical tradition, the Sheka, the Shekelesh, the Denian, and others whose identification with later peoples or with specific Bronze Age Aegean populations has been debated without definitive resolution. What the archaeological record shows, in remarkable consistency across a huge geographic range, is destruction and abandonment at exactly this period. Ugarit, the great Syrian port city whose commercial archives have provided one of the richest documentary records of the Late Bronze Age, was destroyed around 1185 BCE and never rebuilt. The letters found in the ruins describe a city under siege, appeals to allies for help, reports of enemies appearing by sea, the frantic communications of a community that sensed the end coming. One letter, found in the kiln where it was being fired for delivery never sent, describes an attack by ships at sea. The enemy ships in the middle of the sea, Hattusa, the Hittite capital in central Anatolia, was destroyed around 1180 BCE and abandoned permanently. The great palace complexes of the Levantine coast, Megiddo, Hazor, Lachish, show destruction layers at this period. Enkomi and Kition on Cyprus, the most important copper-producing region in the Bronze Age Mediterranean, were destroyed and rebuilt in reduced form. The destruction horizon is unmistakable and consistent. Something happened around 1200 to 1180 BCE that ended the Bronze Age world from the Aegean to the Levant. The catastrophe came. Sometime between 1200 and 1150 BCE, Mycenae, Tiryns, Thebes, Orchomenos, Pylos, all of them burned, their administrative records going up with them, their craftsmen and administrators dispersing or dying, their trading networks dissolving, their diplomatic relationships with Egypt and the Hittites, and the Levantine city-states falling silent. The population of mainland Greece fell dramatically. Estimates of the decline range from 50 to 75%. Over the course of the 12th century BCE, the writing system, Linear B, the tool through which the palace administrators had tracked the movements of hundreds of workers and thousands of jars of oil, disappeared entirely. Greece became illiterate. The palace economy that had sustained specialist craftsmen and long-distance traders and administrative scribes and trained warriors could no longer support the specialization that had produced them, and the Greek world contracted into a simpler, more local, more subsistence-oriented mode of life that left almost no archaeological record and no written record whatsoever for the 4 centuries of the Greek Dark Age. What caused the collapse is one of the most important and most difficult questions in ancient history, and the honest scholarly answer is that we still do not fully know, though we know significantly more than we did 50 years ago. The traditional explanation, the Dorian invasion, a migration of new Greek-speaking peoples from the north who displaced the Mycenaeans and destroyed the palace system, has been largely abandoned by modern scholarship, partly because the archaeological evidence does not support a clear pattern of destruction consistent with a conquest from the north, and partly because the Dorian-speaking Greeks of the classical period appear to have been present in the Peloponnese throughout the Bronze Age in ways that make a conquest from outside implausible. The explanation that has gained the most scholarly support in recent decades, sometimes called the systems collapse theory, and associated most prominently with the work of Robert Drews, Brandon Drake and Eric Klein, is that the palace system's collapse was not the product of a single cause, but of the simultaneous failure of multiple interconnected systems. The palace economies of the late Bronze Age were deeply interdependent. They depended on the tin-copper trade for the bronze that was the material basis of the entire military and economic system. They depended on the agricultural surplus of their territories to feed the specialist population that palace production required. They depended on the diplomatic relationships with Egypt and the Hittites and the Levantine cities that structured the commercial network, and they depended on the political stability of the palace authority itself to maintain the bureaucratic apparatus that organized everything else. When multiple stresses hit the system simultaneously, as appears to have happened between roughly 1200 and 1180 BCE, The interdependence that had been the system's strength became its greatest vulnerability. The climate record shows a prolonged drought in the eastern Mediterranean in precisely this period. Pollen cores from sites across the region show a dramatic reduction in agricultural activity, consistent with a significant reduction in rainfall for several decades around 1200 BCE. A drought that reduced agricultural surplus would have reduced the ability of the palaces to feed their specialist populations, reduced the trading goods they had available to exchange, and reduced the resources available for maintaining the military establishments that protected the palace territories. At the same time, the appearance of the Sea Peoples, the groups of maritime raiders and migrants whose movement across the eastern Mediterranean is recorded in Egyptian inscriptions and whose attacks on the Egyptian delta, Pharaoh Rameses III, recorded with dramatic specificity at Medinet Habu, was disrupting the trade routes that the palace economies depended on and attacking the Levantine city-states, whose commercial networks were integral to the whole system. Ugarit, one of the most important commercial cities of the Bronze Age Levant, was destroyed around 1185 BCE, and the letters found in the ruins describe a situation of desperate emergency, ships arriving carrying news of attacks, requests for military assistance, appeals to Egypt that received no response because Egypt was itself under attack. The Hittite Empire, which had been one of the two great land powers of the Bronze Age Near East alongside Egypt, collapsed in the same period, its capital Hattusa destroyed and abandoned around 1180 BCE, its system of vassal states in Anatolia disintegrating without the imperial authority that had bound them together. The late Bronze Age international order, the network of great powers that the Amarna letters describe, exchanging gifts and princesses and commercial agreements in the language of brotherly equality, simply ceased to exist within the space of a generation. In this context of general systemic failure, the specific destruction of the Mycenaean palaces makes sense as part of a pattern rather than as an isolated event. The Greek mainland was at the periphery of the collapse in geographic terms. The eastern Mediterranean had been disrupted first and worst, but the disruption of the trade networks that supplied the tin and copper that the palace economies required, combined with the agricultural stress of the drought, and possibly combined with internal social tensions that the palace redistributive economy had been suppressing, produced a crisis that the palace system could not survive. Whether the actual destruction of the palaces was accomplished by external raiders, by internal rebellion, by neighbouring Mycenaean states attacking each other in a period of collapsing resources, or by some combination of all three, the archaeological evidence is ambiguous enough that the honest answer is probably all of the above, varying by site and by decade. What is clear is that the destruction was complete and relatively rapid. The palaces were not rebuilt. The administrative system was not re-established. The writing was not continued. The trade networks were not restored. The population dispersed, contracted, or died. The memory of what had existed before the collapse survived not in documents. There were none, but in stories, passed from generation to generation across 4 centuries of increasingly mythologized retelling, until a poet of the archaic period received the tradition and made of it something that would last as long as the Western world lasted. The Greek Dark Age, the 4 centuries between roughly 1100 and 700 BCE, is dark, not because nothing happened in it, but because the archaeological record is thin. The population was reduced, and writing had disappeared entirely from the Greek world. But recent archaeological work has been gradually illuminating this period in ways that the older historiography, which tended to treat it as a simple gap between Bronze Age sophistication and archaic recovery, did not adequately represent. The settlements that replaced the Mycenaean palaces in the early Dark Age were smaller, simpler, and more local in their economic orientation than the palace communities they succeeded. The archaeological signature of the Dark Age is the transition from the elaborate Mycenaean pottery tradition, the specific styles and shapes and decoration schemes that the palace workshops had standardized, to the sub-Mycenaean style, a simplified, locally variable ceramic tradition that reflects the fragmentation of the palace production system into local craftsmanship of reduced technical ambition. The proto-geometric style that follows sub-Mycenaean, emerging around 1050 BCE, shows the first signs of artistic recovery. The careful geometric decoration of circles and semicircles and hatched triangles that the Athenian potters developed, and that became the basis for the geometric style of the 9th and 8th centuries, shows a craftsman tradition beginning to redevelop the confidence and the ambition that the palace collapse had interrupted. Athens played a specific role in the Dark Age recovery that the archaeological and later literary evidence both support. The citadel of Athens, the Acropolis, which had been a Mycenaean palace in the Bronze Age, appears to have maintained a degree of settlement continuity through the Dark Age that many other Mycenaean centres did not, and the Attic ceramic tradition of the Dark Age is the most continuous and the most artistically innovative of the regional traditions, suggesting that Athens or its immediate hinterland maintained a degree of cultural productivity through the worst of the collapse that other regions did not. The later Athenian claim to have been the primary preserver of Greek civilization through the Dark Age, and the specific Athenian role in the colonization movements of the early first millennium that repopulated abandoned regions of the Aegean, are connected to this apparent continuity. The population decline that the archaeological survey evidence documents for the Greek Dark Age was real and substantial. The number of identifiable settlements drops dramatically between the late Bronze Age and the early Dark Age, and the total habitation area of those settlements drops even more dramatically, suggesting both fewer sites and smaller communities at each surviving site. The recovery, when it came, was gradual and uneven, beginning in the more sheltered coastal regions and the island communities that maintained maritime contact with each other and with the Levant through the worst of the collapse, spreading back to the mainland interior as the agricultural recovery and the demographic recovery enabled the expansion of settlement into previously abandoned territories. The Greek Dark Age, the 4 centuries between roughly 1100 and 700 BCE, is dark not because nothing happened. What we know of it comes primarily from archaeology, from later Greek accounts of the period that are themselves mythologized, and from the comparative evidence of what societies tend to do when a complex civilization collapses into something simpler. The picture that emerges is of a Greek world that had lost most of the institutional complexity of the Bronze Age, but that retained the language, the religion, the fundamental cultural categories, and above all the stories of the Mycenaean world in forms that were progressively transformed by the distance between the experience being remembered and the world doing the remembering. The oral tradition that preserved these stories was not a passive repository. It was a living, performing, constantly evolving cultural technology for maintaining collective memory in a world without writing, and it worked by the same processes that oral traditions everywhere use. Formulaic language that preserves meaning in memorable packages. The narrative conventions that make complex stories reproducible without the exact word-for-word preservation that writing enables, the embedding of specific cultural knowledge about the geography of the Aegean, about the practices of Bronze Age warfare, about the names and relationships of the great families, in narrative frameworks that make them transmissible across generations. The specific heroes of the tradition, Achilles and Odysseus and Agamemnon and Helen and Hector, were not invented by Homer. They were the inherited characters of a tradition that had been building since the Bronze Age collapse, and Homer's genius, whatever it was the genius of synthesis and formal perfection, of taking what the tradition provided and making of it the specific poems that we have. The alphabet that the Greeks adopted from the Phoenicians around 800 BCE, the technology that allowed Homer's poems to be written down and that eventually replaced the oral tradition as the primary means of cultural transmission, was a different writing technology from the linear B syllabary in almost every meaningful way. Linear B was the administrative tool of a palace bureaucracy used by specialists to keep economic records, deliberately complex enough that its mastery required training and restricted its use to the palace administrative class. The Phoenician-derived Greek alphabet was simple enough that a child could learn it in weeks, flexible enough to represent any spoken Greek sound with a small set of signs, available to anyone rather than restricted to palace scribes. It was a democratizing technology in the deepest sense. It made literacy accessible to populations that had never had access to it, and the explosion of Greek cultural production in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE was in significant part the result of a newly literate population encountering ideas and developing them with a speed and a freedom that the palace administrative literacy of the Bronze Age had never permitted. The legacy of Mycenaean civilization in the classical Greek world was present everywhere and acknowledged almost nowhere, but the specific forms that the acknowledgement took when it did occur are themselves revealing about how deeply the Bronze Age had shaped the world that came after it. The great Pan-Hellenic Games at Olympia, which tradition dated to 776 BCE, and which represented the most important recurring cultural event in the Greek world, were held at a site whose sacred character went back to the Bronze Age. The specific sanctuary of Zeus at Olympia sat on ground that Bronze Age remains have been found beneath, and the specific games, the running, the wrestling, the chariot racing, the pentathlon, were competitions whose forms preserved the memory of the warrior training that the Bronze Age elite had made central to their identity. The prizes at Olympia were garlands of wild olive, not gold or silver, because the games were understood as competitions for honour, for kleos, for the public recognition of excellence that the Homeric warrior had valued above everything, including his own life. The Homeric value system, the system in which excellence in competition was the primary expression of aristocratic identity, and in which public recognition of that excellence was the primary social reward, was the value system that the Pan-Hellenic Games institutionalized and that classical Greek culture maintained as the central organizing principle of aristocratic life. Greek tragedy, which emerged in Athens in the 6th century BCE, and which reached its classical form in the works of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides in the 5th century, drew almost exclusively on the mythological repertoire of the Mycenaean heroic tradition. The Oresteia of Aeschylus, the trilogy that follows the fate of the house of Atreus from Agamemnon's murder on his return from Troy through Orestes' revenge killing of his mother to the final resolution at Athens, is a sustained engagement with the specifically Mycenaean story of the returning king and the disrupted household. The Oedipus plays of Sophocles draw on the Theban cycle. The mythological history of the Labdacid dynasty at Thebes, one of the major Mycenaean palace centres, whose destruction by the Argive expedition of the Seven against Thebes preceded the Trojan War in the mythological chronology. The Trojan War itself, in its various phases and aftermaths, provided the mythological material for tragedies across all three of the surviving tragic playwrights. What the tragedians made of this material was not simply retelling. They used the Bronze Age mythological world as the raw material for philosophical and political and psychological exploration that the myth provided a framework for. The specific choice of the Bronze Age as the domain of tragedy, the world of heroes, of gods who intervened directly in human affairs, of families whose inherited guilt worked itself out across generations with the inevitability of fate, was not accidental. The Bronze Age was the time of mythological intensity, when the stakes were cosmic and the consequences of individual choice were worked out in blood and fire and divine retribution. The distance between the mythological Bronze Age and the actual 5th century BCE present provided the perspective that tragedy requires, close enough to be emotionally accessible, distant enough to be safely explored. The legacy of Mycenaean civilization in the classical Greek world was present everywhere. The Greeks of the classical period did not think of themselves as the heirs of the Bronze Age in the way that historians now understand them to be. They had lost the specific historical memory of the palace economies and the linear B administration and the redistributive system, and what they retained was the mythologized version, the world of Homer and Hesiod and the mythographers, in which the Mycenaean age was the age of heroes, of beings greater and stronger than the men of the present, who had fought wars of cosmic significance on the plains of Troy, and whose family histories provided the narrative material for tragedy and epic and lyric poetry across the classical period. But the traces of the Bronze Age persisted in the classical world in forms that the Greeks themselves did not always recognize. The pantheon of the Greek gods, Zeus and Hera and Athena and Poseidon and the other Olympians, was present in the Linear B tablets 3,000 years before the Parthenon, and the specific characters and relationships of the gods in classical religion were shaped by traditions that went back to the Bronze Age in ways that the classical period could not see, but that we can now, with the tablets to help us. The great Pan-Hellenic sanctuaries, Olympia and Delphi and Delos and Corinth, were often located at sites that had been sacred in the Bronze Age, their sanctity preserving a continuity of religious practice across the Dark Age that the text cannot document but that the archaeology can trace. The heroic tradition, the stories of the great families of the Bronze Age, the Atreides and the Labdacids and the other dynasties whose mythological histories formed the narrative repertoire of Greek tragedy, was the Bronze Age history of the Mycenaean ruling class, mythologized and moralized, and made available as the raw material for the most sophisticated literary tradition in the ancient world. Before the poems are monuments, they are stories, and the specific stories they tell deserve one more careful look before we reach the end of tonight's account. The Iliad's subject is announced in its first word: menace, rage, the wrath of Achilles. The poem covers only a few weeks of the 10-year Trojan War's final year, focusing on the consequences of Achilles' withdrawal from battle after his quarrel with Agamemnon over the captive woman Briseis, a quarrel about honor and status and the specific economics of warrior prestige that the Bronze Age context makes most legible. Agamemnon takes Briseis because he can, because his position as the supreme commander gives him the authority to take from a subordinate what he needs to replace his own loss. Achilles withdraws because submitting to this appropriation would be a public acknowledgement of subordinate status inconsistent with the honor he has earned through his military excellence. The quarrel is about precedence and prestige in a social world where those things were not merely vanity, but the practical substance of social organization. What the Iliad makes of this quarrel is something that goes far beyond the social mechanics of Bronze Age warrior prestige. It makes of it a meditation on mortality, on the relationship between the desire for glory and the necessity of death, on the specific cost of the choice that Achilles makes when he chooses a short, glorious life over a long, obscure one. Achilles knows that if he stays at Troy, he will die young and be remembered forever. If he goes home, he will live long and be forgotten. He chooses Troy and glory, and the poem is the working out of what that choice costs. Above all, in the death of Patroclus, the companion whose death drives Achilles back into battle not for glory but for grief, transforming the poem's central character from a study of pride into a study of loss. The lament that Achilles makes over Patroclus's body, and the scene near the poem's end where Priam comes to Achilles in the night to beg for the return of Hector's body, and Achilles and the old king weep together over their separate losses. These are among the most affecting passages in any literature of any period, and their power is entirely consistent with a Bronze Age cultural world in which the cost of the warrior ideal was understood and mourned as clearly as its glory was celebrated. The Iliad and the Odyssey are, in the end, the Bronze Age's most enduring monument, more durable than the stone walls of Mycenae, more revealing than the Linear B tablets, more present in the cultural life of the Western world than any other artifact of the second millennium BCE. They are not history. They are not documents. They are something more important than either. They are the living form that the Bronze Age's memory took when the palace system collapsed and the writing disappeared and the oral tradition was all that remained. The shape that 5 centuries of remembering and forgetting and reimagining produced when the conditions were finally right for a poet to crystallize it. The shaft-grave kings whose golden death masks Schliemann found are in the poems. The palace administrators who tracked the textile workers in the Linear B tablets are in the poems. The ships that sailed in the network that the Uluburun wreck represents are in the poems. The city on the hill at Hisarlik, whose stones have been broken and rebuilt and broken again through 4,000 years, is in the poems. And the poems are here, still being read, still being translated, still generating new readings and new performances and new adaptations, because the questions they ask about war and homecoming and loyalty and recognition and the cost of 10 years away from the people you love are not Bronze Age questions. They are simply human questions, which is why they have lasted. The specific character of what Odysseus is doing in the Odyssey, the wandering, the disguise, the test of the suitors, the restoration of the proper order of the household, has attracted the attention of scholars for centuries, and the interpretations range from the anthropological to the psychological to the purely aesthetic. The wandering itself, the 10 years of delayed homecoming after the 10 years of the Trojan War, is the structural feature of the Odyssey that most clearly separates it from the Iliad, and that reflects a different aspect of the post-Bronze Age experience. Where the Iliad is about the consequences of the warrior code in its purest expression, the wrath of the greatest warrior disrupting the war that everyone needs to win, the Odyssey is about what happens after the war, about the attempt to return to a world that has been transformed by absence and by the specific demands of survival, in circumstances that require different virtues from those that warfare rewards. Odysseus is the man of many turns, the polytropos of the first word of the poem, whose defining characteristic is not strength or speed or invulnerability, but cunning, adaptability, the ability to survive by intelligence where straightforward force would fail. This is a different hero for a different world, and the specific world that the Odyssey's wandering section describes, whatever its specific sources, is a world of maritime exploration, an encounter with unfamiliar peoples that corresponds to the actual expansion of the Greek world in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, when the oral tradition was being crystallized. The Cyclops, the Sirens, the Lotus Eaters, Scylla and Charybdis, the land of the dead. These episodes have been read as mythologized accounts of specific geographic locations in the Western Mediterranean that Greek sailors were encountering for the first time in the Archaic period, as well as more universally as stages in a psychological journey toward reintegration and self-knowledge. Both readings are probably partly right. The oral tradition preserved the memory of Bronze Age navigation while layering it with the Archaic period's own experience of maritime expansion, and Homer's genius was partly the genius of making the layering feel seamless rather than composite. Penelope, who has been waiting 20 years for a husband who may be dead, who maintains her household and her position against the suitors through a combination of steadfast loyalty and cunning delay that parallels Odysseus's own cunning survival, is one of the great characters of ancient literature. And she is, in the Mycenaean reading, the queen who has been managing the palace in the king's absence, the Husfreya of the heroic tradition whose authority over the household's resources has been systematically undermined by the suitor's consumption of those resources. Her test of the bow, setting the competition through the axes that only Odysseus can win, in effect setting the test that will restore the rightful authority to the palace, is not merely a narrative device. It is the queen's assertion of the palace's own logic, the use of the palace's most intimate knowledge of its king to identify him and restore him, the specific character of what Odysseus is doing in the Odyssey. But there is one reading of the Odyssey that the Mycenaean context makes available in a way that no previous generation of scholars quite had access to. The reading in which Odysseus's return is the return of a palace king to a palace that has been functioning without him for 20 years, in which the test of the suitors is a political test as much as a domestic one, in which what is at stake is not merely the reunion of a husband and wife, but the restoration of the redistributive authority that the Mycenaean palace represented in its specific historical context. The palace of Odysseus in this reading is a Mycenaean wanax, the word used in the Linear B tablets for the palace king, distinct from the basileus, who was a lower-ranking local chieftain, whose absence has created a vacuum of authority that the suitors are trying to fill by marrying the queen, because in the Mycenaean world the authority was inseparable from the household, and the household was inseparable from the palace, and the palace was the economic and political centre of the territory it administered. These suitors eating through Odysseus's stores are not merely behaving badly as future husbands, they are consuming the redistributive resources of the palace economy in ways that are destroying its capacity to function. Odysseus's return and his slaughter of the suitors is the restoration of the palace's redistributive authority, the reassertion of the wanax's control over the resources that the palace economy required to sustain itself. This is not the only reading of the Odyssey, and it may not even be the most important one. But it is the reading that the archaeology and the Linear B tablets make available in a new way, and it suggests that Homer was preserving something more specific than a general story of heroic return. He was preserving the memory of a social world organized around the palace, in ways that the Dark Age had lost and that the Archaic period was trying, in new institutional forms, to reconstitute. The memory of a world in which the king's household was the world's centre, in which the order of the household was the order of everything, and in which the destruction or restoration of that order was the largest possible event. The sites where Mycenaean civilization can be visited today are among the most evocative in the world, and they reward visiting with a quality of immediate historical presence that photographs and reconstructions can suggest but cannot replace. But before the sites, it is worth spending a moment on the broader geography of the Mycenaean world, on the specific distribution of the palace centres and what it tells us about how the political system was organised. The major Mycenaean palace states, Mycenaean Tyrins in the Argolid, Pylos on the southwestern coast of the Peloponnese, Thebes and Orchomenos in Boeotia, Athens in Attica and possibly Iolkos in Thessaly, were not a unified empire under a single authority, but a network of independent palace states that recognized each other's existence, competed with each other for resources and influence, and occasionally cooperated in joint military ventures, of which the Trojan expedition is the most famous, but certainly not the only one. The Hittite texts that mention the king of Ahiawa suggest that there was a political entity significant enough to correspond with the Hittites on an approximately equal basis, which implies some degree of coordination or at least a recognized political center. Some scholars have proposed Mycenae itself as the seat of the Hittites' Ahiawan interlocutor, based on its apparent primacy among the Mycenaean centers. The Mycenaean world also extended beyond the Greek mainland itself. Mycenaean pottery, one of the most distinctive and most exported products of the palace workshops, has been found across the eastern Mediterranean in quantities that map the commercial reach of the Mycenaean trading network. Rhodes was a major Mycenaean commercial centre, its pottery finds showing direct connections to both the Levant and Egypt. Cyprus hosted Mycenaean settlers or commercial agents. The coastal cities of the Levant were importing Mycenaean pottery in substantial quantities. Egypt has produced Mycenaean pottery finds at multiple sites, including the capital at Tel El Amarna, and the specific Mycenaean merchant or diplomatic community that maintained these commercial connections is visible in the material record even when the texts are silent about it. The sites where Mycenaean civilization can be visited today are among the most evocative in the world: the citadel of Mycenae on its rocky hill in the Argolid, with the Lion Gate and the Shaft Grave Circle, and the great cistern cut through the living rock to provide water to the citadel during a siege. A cistern so deep and so ingeniously engineered that the modern visitor descending into it with a flashlight is immediately in the presence of the Bronze Age in a way that is simultaneously archaeological and physical. The rough-cut stone walls pressing close, the darkness absolute beyond the light's reach, the silence total. The walls of Tiryns, the fortified palace a few miles from Mycenae, whose massive stone blocks, some of them weighing as much as 13 tons, gave the structure the name that the Greeks of the classical period applied to it, Cyclopean, meaning that only the Cyclopes could have moved stone so large, because no human generation had the technology to have done it. The palace at Pylos, excavated and now covered by a protective roof in its marshy coastal setting, where the complete floor plan of a Mycenaean palace can be walked through in a way that the more destroyed sites do not allow, where the throne room and the pantries and the oil storage rooms and the bath that Telemachus uses in the Odyssey when he visits Nestor's palace can all be identified and located in their relationships to each other. The architecture of the poem's setting made suddenly and precisely real. The site of Glaia in Boeotia, on an island in what was once the largest freshwater lake in Greece, and is now drained farmland, where a Mycenaean fortress of extraordinary size, larger than the citadels of Mycenae and Tiryns combined, rises on the rock of the former island, suggesting that the Boeotian Mycenaeans had achieved a degree of territorial organization and military capability that the surviving palace texts barely hint at. And Troy itself, Hisarlik, the hill above the flat plain of the Troad, where the rivers Scamander and Simois run down from the mountains to the sea, where the walls of Troy Sevner can be seen in the trench that a century and a half of excavation has cut through the accumulated layers of 4,000 years of occupation, where the view from the top of the mound over the plain to the sea gives the visitor a sudden, disorienting sense of recognition. The geography corresponds so precisely to what the poem describes that the body understands something before the mind has time to formulate it. The sea is there, the plain is there, the mountains are there, and the wall, some portion of the wall, is there. Something happened here. The specific what and when and how will be debated for as long as people read Homer and dig in the ground of Anatolia, but the somewhere and the sometime are not in doubt. The night is settling in, and the Bronze Age has reached the end of the part of its story that we can tell in one sitting, though the consequences reach forward through Homer to the classical period, through the classical period to Rome, through Rome to the entire subsequent history of the Western literary and philosophical tradition, in chains of influence and inheritance so long and so various that tracing them would require not one night, but many. The palace at Pylos burned sometime around 1180 BCE, and the tablets baked in the fire that destroyed it were deciphered in 1952. And what they said, when Michael Ventris read them, was that the Bronze Age Greeks had been keeping records in Greek, in an early, archaic, palace form of the language that Homer would use 3 centuries later to describe the world those records documented. The connection was always there. It took 3,000 years and a British architect working in his spare time to see it. The shaft-grave kings at Mycenae were not Agamemnon, but Agamemnon was made of them, made of the memory of men like them, men who were buried in gold and whose deaths were significant enough to be remembered across centuries of oral tradition, whose specific identity dissolved but whose type survived, becoming the model for the great king whose face launched 1,000 ships and whose return from Troy was paid for with his own life at his own hearth, in the myth that the Greeks found most compelling about the cost of power and the corruption of the household that power requires. The truth behind the myth is the Bronze Age. The myth was all that survived the Bronze Age's end, and the myth has proven, in the 3,000 years since the palaces burned, more durable than the palaces. Let that settle around you now. The palace at Mycenae is dark tonight, and the shaft graves are silent, and the Linear B tablets are in their cases in the museums of Athens and London and Heraklion. Their records of oil and grain and bronze and women and children preserved by the fire that destroyed everything else. The Lion Gate is still standing. The walls of Tirin still carry their impossible stones. The hill at Hisarlik is still there above the plain. And somewhere in the tradition that connects those ruins to the poems and the poems to us, the memory of the Bronze Age is still alive, changed almost beyond recognition, but continuous. A thread that runs from the shaft grave to the megaron, to the Linear B tablet, to the oral tradition, to the poem, to the page you have read, or the screen you have watched and the voice you are hearing now. It is a very long thread. It has not broken yet. Rest easy.